So there was this one night at work that still messes with my head, and every time I think about it, I get this weird, uneasy feeling. I used to work at this small retail store. You know the kind. One of those chain stores that has pretty much everything from clothes to kitchen stuff, but it's not big enough to be a department store. I usually worked the evening shifts, and I liked it that way. It was quiet, not too many customers, and I could just get things done without much stress. That night was pretty typical at first. I was working with one other person, Sarah, and she was up at the front register while I was in charge of the back. The back room, man, that's where things get interesting. I never really liked being back there alone. It's not that it was creepy, but the room was huge, and the way it was set up made it feel like you were always a bit too isolated from the rest of the store. You couldn't hear much from the front, and once the heavy metal door shut behind you, it felt like you were in a completely different place. Anyway, part of my job that night was organizing some of the overstock. You know, the boxes that hadn't been put on the shelves yet, stuff that got delivered earlier that day. There were maybe 15 boxes, all piled up against the far wall, and my job was to sort them and make sure everything was labeled correctly for the morning crew. Not exactly thrilling, but it was mindless work, which I didn't mind after a long day. The back room was lit by those annoying flickering fluorescent lights, which gave the whole room this sterile, buzzing hum. I walked in, shut the door behind me, and got to work. I'd been back there for maybe 20 minutes when I heard this sound. It was faint, just a slight scuffling noise, like something shifting. At first I figured it was just a box settling, or maybe a rat. We had a problem with them sometimes, and they loved to make noise in the back. I shrugged it off and kept working, but then I heard it again. This time it was more distinct, like a soft thud. It came from the far corner of the room, behind a bunch of shelving units where we stored the older stock. I stopped what I was doing, stood up, and listened. There was nothing but the buzzing of the lights. I told myself it was probably just more boxes shifting, but something about it felt off. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked over to the far side of the back room. The shelves there were stacked high with boxes that hadn't been touched in months, maybe even years. I shone the light between the shelves, half expecting to see a rat scurrying away, but there was nothing. I stood there for a minute, feeling a little silly for getting freaked out over a couple of noises. But as I turned to head back to the main area, I saw something that stopped me cold. One of the shelving units wasn't quite flush against the wall like the others. It was slightly pulled away, just enough to see a small gap between the shelf and the wall. And behind it was a door I'd never seen before. Now I'd been working at this place for over a year, and I'd spent more time in the back room than I'd care to admit. I knew every inch of that place, or at least I thought I did. But I'd never noticed this door before, and it looked old, like it had been there forever, hidden behind the shelves. The paint on it was chipped and peeling, and the doorknob looked rusted. Curiosity got the best of me. I moved the shelf a little more to get a better look, and then reached out to grab the doorknob. It felt cold and stiff, like it hadn't been touched in a long time. I hesitated for a second, thinking maybe I should just leave it alone. But of course I didn't. I turned the knob and the door creaked open. What I saw on the other side wasn't what I expected. It wasn't another storage area or a hidden closet. It was a small, narrow hallway, barely wide enough for me to walk through without brushing against the walls. The air inside smelled musty, like it hadn't been ventilated in years. I shone my phone's flashlight down the hallway, but the light didn't reach the end. It just stretched on into the darkness. For a second, I thought about going back, shutting the door, and forgetting I ever saw it. But something about that hallway made me want to see where it led. Maybe it was just the need to know, or maybe I'd seen too many horror movies and thought it would be fun to explore a hidden part of the store. Either way, I stepped inside. The further I walked, the colder it got. The walls were rough, like unfinished concrete, and the floor was uneven, with cracks running through it. It was dead silent, too. No sound of the store, no buzzing lights, nothing. Just me and the quiet. After walking for what felt like forever, I reached another door at the end of the hallway. This door was different from the one in the back room. It was metal, old and rusty, with no doorknob, just a small handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I stood there for a minute, staring at it, trying to decide if I really wanted to open it. Every instinct was telling me to turn around, go back to the store, and pretend I hadn't just found some weird hidden hallway. But of course, I didn't listen. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door groaned as it opened, and inside was, well, I'm not even sure how to describe it. It was another room, bigger than I expected, with shelves lining the walls, just like the back room. But the shelves weren't stocked with boxes or inventory. They were covered in old, dusty papers, files, and binders. In the middle of the room was a single desk, old and worn, with a chair pushed back like someone had left in a hurry. I walked inside, shining my light around. The place felt abandoned, like it hadn't been touched in years. But the weirdest part? There were still papers scattered on the desk, like someone had been in the middle of something and just stopped. I picked up one of the papers, but it didn't make any sense. It was filled with strange symbols and numbers, scribbled in handwriting that was hard to read. I put the paper down, feeling this creeping sense of dread wash over me. What was this place? Why was it hidden in the back of the store? And why did it feel like no one was supposed to know about it? As I stood there, trying to make sense of everything, I heard the door behind me slam shut. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been when I walked through. I ran to the door and yanked it open, half expecting to see someone standing on the other side, but again, nothing. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind the shelves in the room. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the panic rising. I shone my flashlight toward the shelves, but the light barely penetrated the darkness. The footsteps got closer, and I swear, I could hear someone breathing. I didn't wait to find out who or what was in there with me. I bolted. I ran back down the hallway, not even bothering to look behind me. The air felt colder, heavier, like it was pressing down on me as I ran. My footsteps echoed off the walls, mixing with the sound of the other footsteps that seemed to be chasing me. I reached the door to the back room, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it. I stood there for a second, catching my breath, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. But when I looked back at the shelf, the door was gone. The gap between the shelf and the wall was closed, like it had never been there in the first place. I didn't tell Sarah what happened. I didn't tell anyone. I just finished my shift, kept my head down, and left as soon as I could. I quit that job a few weeks later. I couldn't stand being in that back room anymore, especially after dark. Every time I walked in there, I felt like someone was watching me, like the walls were closing in. I never went back to check if the door was still there. But sometimes, late at night, I think about it, and I wonder if it was all in my head, or if maybe, just maybe, there's something back there that no one is supposed to find. Alright, let me tell you about something that happened to me when I used to work in retail. It's one of those things that still makes my skin crawl, even though nothing technically supernatural happened. But it's real, and it freaked me out enough that I can't step into a store's back room without thinking about it. I was working at this big box store, the kind that has everything from groceries to clothes and electronics. I was just a regular stock employee, and one of my main responsibilities was to make sure the shelves stayed filled. The back room of the store was where all the extra inventory was kept before it made its way out onto the sales floor. I spent hours back there, stacking boxes, unloading shipments, that sort of thing. It was a massive space with towering metal shelves that seemed to go on forever. I got used to the weird dim lighting and the strange hum from the old AC unit, but there was always something about that back room that felt off. Now, I'm not the type of person who gets scared easily, and when you spend enough time in a place like that, you learn to brush off the random noises, the creaks from the shelving, or the occasional box falling. It's just stuff settling, right? That's what I always told myself. But one night, things got a little too strange to ignore. It was one of those late shifts where the store was about to close. The customers were gone, and it was just me and a couple of other employees finishing up for the night. My job was to organize a new shipment of stock that had come in that afternoon. I'd been back there for a couple of hours already, headphones in, zoning out to my music while I worked. Around 9 p.m., I started noticing weird noises. At first, it was just a faint tapping sound, like something tapping against the shelves. I pulled out one of my earbuds, thinking it might be one of the guys from the front coming back to help me out. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I didn't think too much of it. Like I said, the back room was old and noisy. I shrugged it off and went back to work. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Only this time it was louder, It wasn't just random tapping, it sounded like footsteps, like someone walking slowly between the shelves. The thing was, the back room was huge, and the sound seemed to be coming from the far end, in a section that was rarely used. Most of the time, we only stored old seasonal stuff back there, or things that weren't in high demand. No one had any reason to be back there, especially not this late. I stood up and looked toward the far end of the room, my heart starting to beat a little faster. It was quiet now, just the low hum of the AC unit filling the space. I walked over to the break in the shelves and peeked down the aisle, but everything looked normal, just rows and rows of boxes, stacked high and neat. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like there was someone, or something, lurking just out of sight, watching me. I considered going back to the front and asking one of the others if they'd been messing around, but I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. So I brushed it off again and kept working. About half an hour later, I had moved on to the middle section of the back room, closer to the loading dock. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they were faster, like someone was running. I froze, my pulse quickening. The sound echoed through the back room, growing louder before suddenly stopping, as if whoever or whatever was running had just disappeared. I was done pretending it was nothing. I grabbed my walkie-talkie and called up to the front. "Hey, is anyone back here with me?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but I'm sure my voice gave away how freaked out I was. One of the cashiers, Dave, replied, "Nah, man, it's just you. We're up front closing up." Great, that meant I was alone. At that point, I couldn't stand being in the back room by myself anymore. I finished up as quickly as I could and made my way to the front, leaving the rest of the stock for the morning shift. When I got to the register, I joked with the guys about how creepy the back room felt sometimes, but I didn't go into detail. I didn't want to sound like a complete wuss. The next day, I went in for another shift. This time, I was on early, so I figured things would feel less eerie during the daytime. And they did at first. But halfway through my shift, I had to go back to the same section of the back room to get some extra stock. As soon as I stepped into that part of the room, I noticed something strange. The boxes that I had stacked up the night before, neatly organized on the shelves, were now on the floor, scattered everywhere. It looked like someone had come through and pulled them down. There were even a few deep scratch marks on the side of one of the metal shelves, like something had clawed at it. I stood there for a minute, just staring, trying to figure out how that could have happened. Maybe someone had accidentally knocked them over this morning and didn't bother to clean it up, but even that didn't make sense. The marks on the shelves were too deliberate, like someone had dragged something heavy across them. I called over my manager to take a look, and he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a loose box that fell and took the rest down with it, but I knew that wasn't right. The way those boxes were stacked, there was no way they would have just tumbled down on their own like that. After that, I started avoiding the back room as much as I could. I asked to be put on register more often, or I'd find reasons to stick to the front of the store. But every now and then, I'd get stuck on backroom duty, and every time I went back there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until a few months later that I finally learned what had been going on. One of the older employees, Jerry, who'd been working there for years, told me a story during a slow shift. We were talking about weird things that had happened in the store, and I brought up the back room. Jerry laughed, but not in a funny way, more like a knowing chuckle. "Oh, you don't know, do you?" he said. "Know what?" I asked. He leaned in a little closer and lowered his voice. "A few years ago, before you started, one of the guys who worked back there went missing." I raised an eyebrow. "Missing? What do you mean?" Jerry shrugged. "Just like I said. He was doing inventory one night after closing. No one else was here except the manager. They found his stuff in the back room the next morning, his phone, his jacket, everything. But he was gone. No trace of him. Police came, searched the place, but they never found him. I felt a chill run down my spine. And no one knows what happened?" Jerry shook his head. "Nope. It's like he just disappeared into thin air. After that, they started locking up the back room tighter at night. But every now and then, you still hear things back there, like someone moving around." I laughed it off at the time, but deep down it freaked me out. I never wanted to be alone in that back room again. And to this day, whenever I'm in a big store and I see the door to the back room, I get that same uneasy feeling, like something's watching from the other side, waiting. The scariest part, I'll never know what really happened to that guy, and maybe it's better that way. Alright, let me tell you about this one time I was working late in the back room of this retail store I used to work at. It's a place I'd been at for a while, just one of those typical big box stores with aisles full of everything you can imagine: groceries, electronics, clothes, all that. It wasn't a bad job, just your regular shifts dealing with customers, stocking shelves, and managing the inventory. But the back room? Man, the back room always had this weird vibe. I'm not saying I believed in anything spooky, but something about that place just made me uneasy. It was one of those shifts where I was closing alone. The store wasn't that busy during the weekdays, so I was assigned to do some inventory and get things ready for the next morning. No big deal, right? I was used to it. The manager had left a couple of hours earlier, and it was just me, left to make sure everything was locked up properly. The back room itself was this long, dimly lit space behind the sales floor, with tall shelves packed with all kinds of random stuff: seasonal decorations, extra stock of electronics, boxes full of things that hadn't sold yet. The overhead lights were these flickering fluorescents that gave everything this eerie, sickly glow. And the air back there? Stale. Like no one had bothered to ventilate the place in years. So I'm going about my night, scanning boxes, checking off inventory sheets, and restocking a few shelves. Everything's pretty routine until I start hearing this faint noise. At first I thought it was just the sound of the building settling. Old places like that make noises sometimes, you know. But this was different. It was this soft, rhythmic thumping, like something was tapping against one of the shelves. I stopped what I was doing, pulled my earbuds out, and listened. Nothing. Just the hum of the lights. I shrugged it off, assuming it was probably nothing. But then, a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder. A distinct thud, like someone had dropped something heavy on the concrete floor. Now at this point, I'm thinking maybe I just knocked something over without realizing it. So I start looking around the shelves near me, but everything seemed in place. No boxes out of line, nothing that looked like it had fallen. I continued working, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You know how sometimes you can just feel when someone's watching you? That's what it felt like. Even though I knew I was alone, it was like the air had changed, heavier. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but the back room was as empty as ever. I tried to focus, getting through the inventory as fast as I could, hoping to just finish up and get out of there. But then things got weird. There was this old storage section in the far corner of the back room that we barely ever used. It was mostly for old equipment, like outdated computers, damaged merchandise, and random stuff that we couldn't sell. It was the one spot I tried to avoid, mainly because it was just creepy back there. But tonight, I had to go back there to pull out some boxes we needed for a sale display the next day. I grabbed a cart and pushed it to the corner, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. The further back I went, the darker it seemed to get. The overhead lights barely reached that far, and the shadows felt longer somehow. I found the boxes I needed and started loading them onto the cart when I heard it again. A distinct, deliberate thud. This time it sounded like it was coming from the other side of one of the tall shelves, deeper into the storage area. My stomach dropped. There shouldn't have been anyone back there. The store had been closed for hours, and I knew for a fact I was the only person working that night. I stood there, holding a box in my hands, frozen, just listening. Then I heard it, a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. At this point, my heart was racing. I wasn't sure what to do. My logical side was telling me it was probably just some animal, maybe a rat or something that had gotten in. But another part of me, the part that was standing there with my pulse pounding in my ears, was telling me to get out of there. I put the box down on the cart as quietly as I could and started backing away. But as I did, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat, and I whipped around, looking behind the shelves. There was nothing. No one. Just rows of dusty old equipment and boxes. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just tired, that the shadows were playing tricks on me. So I grabbed the cart and started heading back toward the front of the back room. But as I passed one of the shelves, something caught my eye. There was this old door I'd never noticed before. It was small, tucked between two tall racks of boxes, almost hidden in the corner. The door was made of wood with chipped white paint and a rusty metal handle. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been opened in years. For some reason, I felt drawn to it, like I needed to know what was behind it. I walked over and grabbed the handle. It was cold, colder than I expected, like it had been sitting in a freezer. I turned the knob, and to my surprise, the door creaked open. Behind it was a small room, about the size of a walk-in closet. The walls were made of cinder block, and the floor was bare concrete. But there was something strange about it. The air inside was even colder than the back room, and it had this weird, musty smell, like the room hadn't been touched in decades. And there, in the center of the room, was a single wooden chair, facing the back wall. I felt a chill run down my spine. The chair was old, the kind you'd see in a school classroom, with a chipped wooden seat and metal legs that had started to rust. There was nothing else in the room. No windows, no lights, just the chair and the eerie silence. I don't know why, but something about that room made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. I stood in the doorway for what felt like forever, just staring at the chair, trying to make sense of why it was there. My mind was racing with questions. Who put it there? Why was the door hidden? Why did the room feel so unsettling? That's when I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were right behind me. I spun around, my heart nearly jumping out of my chest, but there was no one there. The back room was completely empty, just as it had been before. But I knew I hadn't imagined the sound. It was real. Someone, or something, had been standing right behind me. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and rushed back to the front of the store. I didn't even finish the inventory. I grabbed my stuff, clocked out, and practically ran to my car. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key into the ignition. The next day, I told my manager about the hidden room, but he just brushed it off, saying it was probably just an old storage area that no one used anymore. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that place. I went back to work, but I made sure to avoid the back room as much as possible. I didn't want to go near that door again. To this day, I still think about that night. I've worked in plenty of places since then, but I've never experienced anything like that. I don't know what was in that room or why it made me feel the way it did, but I do know one thing. Whatever was behind me that night, I'm glad I didn't see it. Alright, so this happened a couple of years ago when I was working at a small retail store. It wasn't the kind of place that stayed super busy, just a steady flow of customers throughout the day, mostly regulars. I'd been working there for a few months and had pretty much gotten into a routine. You know, stocking shelves, handling the register, organizing the back room, that kind of stuff. The back room was where we kept all the inventory. It wasn't anything special, just a typical storage area with shelves full of boxes, cleaning supplies, and stuff that hadn't made it to the floor yet. But here's the thing. It was always a little creepy back there. The lights were old, and sometimes they'd flicker. There were no windows, so it always felt a little claustrophobic, like you were cut off from the rest of the world. Still, I'd gotten used to it. After all, it was part of the job. One night, I was closing up with a coworker named Jake. It was a quiet evening, like most nights. We hadn't had any customers for the last hour, and we were just waiting for the clock to hit 9 so we could lock up and head out. Jake was up front, sweeping near the registers, and I was in the back room, finishing up some last-minute organization. I had a few boxes to unpack and put away, nothing too heavy. As I was stacking a few things on one of the higher shelves, I heard this noise. It was faint, just a soft thud, like something had fallen over. At first, I didn't think much of it. Like I said, the back room was old, and sometimes the shelves would creak or shift, especially if things weren't stacked properly. I kept working, not giving it a second thought, but then I heard it again, this time louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a random noise. It was like something or someone was moving around back there. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The back room wasn't that big, and there weren't a lot of places someone could hide. It was just rows of shelves and some space in between to walk around. "Jake?" I called out, thinking maybe he'd come back there for something. No response. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably just the building settling or something. I went back to unpacking the boxes, trying to ignore the weird feeling creeping up the back of my neck. But the noise came again, this time from the far corner of the room, where we stored some old stock that hardly ever got touched. Now I'd been working in that store long enough to know the back room like the back of my hand. That corner didn't get used much, and there was no reason for anything to be moving over there. My gut told me to just leave it alone, but curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and headed toward the corner. The closer I got, the colder the room felt. It was weird because the back room was usually pretty stuffy, especially in the summer, but this was different. It was like I had stepped into a draft or something, and the temperature dropped a few degrees. I shone the light over the shelves, scanning for anything out of place. At first, everything looked normal. Just boxes stacked up, some old cleaning supplies, nothing that should have made any noise. But then, as I moved the light further down, I noticed something odd. One of the boxes had been pushed out of place, like it had been moved. It wasn't like someone had bumped into it. There was a noticeable gap between the box and the wall, almost like someone had slid it out deliberately. I walked over, crouched down, and looked behind the box. There was something there, something I hadn't noticed before. It was a door. Now I'd been in that back room a million times, and I swear, I had never seen that door before. It was tucked behind the shelf, almost like it had been hidden. It was an old metal door, the kind that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The paint was chipped, and there were rust spots around the edges. There was no handle, just a small latch. I stood there for a minute, staring at it, trying to figure out if I should open it. Part of me wanted to just walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it, but another part of me, probably the stupid part, was too curious to leave it alone. I reached out and pulled the latch. The door creaked open, and I was hit with this musty, stale air. It smelled like dust and old cardboard, like something that had been sealed off for a long time. I shone my flashlight into the space beyond the door. It was a narrow hallway, maybe 3 feet wide, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. The floor was uneven, like it hadn't been properly finished, and the further down the hallway I looked, the darker it got. I should have stopped there. I should have just closed the door and gone back to the front, but instead I stepped inside. The hallway felt even colder than the back room, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. I walked slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the concrete. The walls were close enough that I could touch them with both hands if I stretched out my arms. It was strange. There were no pipes or electrical wires running through the walls, nothing that suggested this hallway had any purpose. After walking for what felt like a minute, I reached the end of the hallway. There was another door, identical to the one I had just come through, with the same rusted latch. My heart was racing at this point. Something about the whole situation just felt wrong, but I was too far in to turn back. I reached out and opened the second door. What I found on the other side was unsettling. It was another room, about the same size as the back room, but completely empty. The walls were bare concrete, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, like no one had been in there for years. In the center of the room was a single chair, metal and rusted, sitting under a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The light was off, but the bulb looked like it could still work if someone turned it on. I walked into the room, my footsteps leaving tracks in the dust. I don't know why I kept going. Every instinct was telling me to get out of there, but I couldn't help myself. There was something about that room that felt unfinished, like I was walking into a place that wasn't meant to be found. As I stood there, looking around, I heard the door behind me slam shut. I whipped around, shining my flashlight on the door, but it was closed, just like before. I ran to it, grabbed the latch, and pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. It was stuck, like it had locked itself from the other side. Panic started to set in. I pounded on the door, yelling for Jake, hoping he'd hear me from the front of the store, but the walls were thick, and there was no way my voice was getting through. I was trapped. For a minute, I just stood there, trying to figure out what to do. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing. That's when I noticed something else. There was a sound, a faint scratching noise, coming from the corner of the room. I turned my flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there, just more concrete walls and dust. The sound was soft, almost like something was scraping against the floor, but I couldn't see anything. I started to back away, my hands shaking. I kept the flashlight pointed at the corner, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The scratching continued, getting louder and closer, but there was still nothing there. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, the scratching stopped. The room fell silent again, and I was left standing in the middle of that cold, empty space, completely alone. After what felt like forever, I heard the door creak open behind me. I didn't even think. I bolted out of the room, down the hallway, and back into the back room. I slammed the first door shut behind me and ran to the front of the store. Jake was still up front, counting the cash in the register. He looked up at me, confused, and asked if I was okay. I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my stuff and told him I was leaving early. I didn't care if he thought I was acting weird. I just needed to get out of there. I never told Jake about the door or the room. I didn't even go back into the back room for the rest of my time working there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place. Like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to find. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed in that room a little longer.